Hello and welcome back to yet another episode on the Mission Shunya podcast. Well, first things first, for the loyal listener in you, apologies for the delay since the last episode. I had everything in place to put out the episode, but unfortunately couldn't get to work because of health reasons. But I am back. Hope you are doing well. I have, as usual, lined up a few interesting conversations over the next few months, so I am really excited for it. So, this week we are going to talk about a topic that we all like to discuss, especially when it comes to carbon sequestration. Why don't we plant more trees? We all know that trees have a big role to play in maintaining the carbon balance, and especially when our target is to get to net zero carbon emissions, why don't we plant more trees? On this episode, you will get to listen to a story about how our guest found his passion and calling and in fact switched careers to get to where he is today. So, who is our guest for today and how is he involved in large scale afforestation?
Hello, I'm Varun Ravindra. I'm the Chief Conservator at Ananthra. Vanantara is a community-led afforestation effort in Shoolagiri, Tamil Nadu, where we have afforested 100 acres of barren land into what is now the beginnings of a young forest.
So, Varun, the first time that I read about you, read your story, it was quite different for someone to have a expertise or a degree in a different field and then switch careers and get into what you're doing now is really phenomenal. So, why don't you give us a brief highlight of your journey so far?
Sure, thank you, Girish. My basic degree is in finance. I'm a chartered accountant by qualification, but I think very early on I realized that I was interested in the environment and animal rights and conservation and things like that. So I spent time working at Cupa. Also, generally anything in terms of newspaper articles that revolved around climate change. Very early on, even perhaps in the late 90s and early 2000s, used to bother me, and I was concerned about why that issue wasn't being addressed more fully.
Okay.
I guess somewhere there was this, desire to do something towards environmental conservation throughout. And but as things go, you follow the very often a standard path when it comes to education.
Correct.
And I did that, and I certainly enjoyed what I did, and pursued that, and worked at Deloitte and continued a role in audit. But increasingly, I realized that my interest was always around topics that revolved around helping alleviate the global warming situation. And at that time, it was called global warming, and now it's called the climate crisis.
Exactly.
It's remarkable and unfortunate that it's become that in 20 years, in such a short time.
True.
So I would find myself reading uh, about things like how you could, if you could keep your tire pressure inflated in your cars, you could reduce fuel consumption by 2%, and how vampire electricity was such a easy problem to tackle, and low hanging fruit. And I would be talking to people in the office about this and switching off lights and monitors, and it was clear to me that my heart lay more in trying to be part of a group of people that were trying to solve for this problem, and that's how that progressed over the years. So I think the seed was there early on. My father, who's a doctor, also took to farming and conservation in the 90s. So I'm
Oh, okay.
certain, yeah, and I'm certain it wasn't explicit, but just listening to him and watching him going about how he did certainly influenced me, because I can recall we would be on drives and he would point out a tree and say, "Look at that tree; it's so beautiful." And it's not common for people to sit and admire trees constantly like that. So I guess just the process of osmosis and being surrounded, perhaps also with people who had that sensibility, made an impact.
That's nice. So, was that the genesis of Vanantara?
That actually Vanantara I think took some time for it to manifest in the form that it did. So as I completed my chartered accountancy, and I was at a crossroad. I could have continued working at Deloitte and continued a career as an auditor, But I also had the opportunity of working at the family farm. It was fairly large by that point in time. It was about 150 acres.
Okay.
And it was interesting because my father was a little more busy with his medical practice, and I had an opportunity to move there and try and experiment and sort of craft some of the things over there in a way that I would have liked. And that's how I first moved away from the mainstream corporate world towards organic farming,
Okay.
because I had to make a transition into the space, and this seemed to me at that point the most logical and obvious route. Also, because people don't realize that agriculture and farming is also one of the biggest causes of global warming and climate change.
Yes.
The way that lands are raised to the ground, or vegetation is destroyed, monocultures, use of pesticides, insecticides, these are significant contributors to the problem we are facing right now. And
Correct.
organic farming is a very important solution towards this. And it's incredible. Back in 2009, when I moved into the space, even in a city like Bangalore, people weren't very familiar with what organic food was. There weren't many organic stores. There was a handful, just about 3 or 4 at the time. You had to educate people on what organic produce was, and that it involved not using insecticides and pesticides. But that was the basic, right? Things
Correct.
like cropping patterns, crop rotation, flora, fauna, etc., was alien to them, and it didn't even matter. So I began by first organic farming, and over a period of time, my father had already laid a lot of fundamentals in the appropriate manner at that farm, and we continued to improve upon that by planting more vegetation, by completely making all of our practices organic, by being self-sustaining in all ways. And it reached a point where the entire ecosystem there was self-sustaining.
Wonderful.
And I still had an intent to continue to do more and plant more. And the obvious solution was to be able to plant more on more land. And at the same time, my own interest moved away from farming towards afforestation, because it became apparent that humanity would not suffer from a lack of food. There was and is an abundance of food already being produced, but we would definitely suffer from a hostile environment.
Correct.
And it became important then to work towards afforesting, because you can either work the oceans or you can work the lands, and I didn't see myself being able to work on the oceans. So it became yeah. It's actually it's a larger carbon sink, but it's perhaps something that requires a lot more technical know-how and craft and coordination to be able to work on the oceans. So for me, it became obvious that I would have to work on afforestation, and this was also at that point in time a lot of news on the cutting of trees across the city, outskirts of the city, and you realize that not just in India but across the globe, publicly owned lands are always poached.
Correct.
It's just how it is. If you look at rainforests in Indonesia and the Amazon and Brazil now, it's the same everywhere, pretty much. So there was a sense that we should have large amounts of privately owned afforested land, where like-minded people continue to nurture that space and ensure that it stays that way for centuries. And then, considering land is so expensive, the next logical step was to be able to see if this could be an endeavor that many like-minded people could buy into, where many people could own smaller portions of land, but collectively you could own a large portion of land to create a sufficiently large ecosystem. Because on your own, if you owned an acre or 2 acres, you would still not be immune to what your neighbors do.
Exactly.
But the moment you have scale, you can create some kind of a microclimate.
When you talk of scale, the 100-acre plot idea came about from this idea that you wanted to have scale. So that's how this conceptualized.
Yeah. I think it helped that the first farm that I worked on was 150 acres.
Okay.
Because the moment you've already spent so much time uh, moving around a space like that, then 100 acres doesn't seem or sound large to you,
True.
and that was a significant advantage. If I had started off perhaps on a 2 acre, 3 acre, 4 acre farm, which are very often conventional sizes for urban farmers, 100 acres would have seemed very large. But also from experience, I realized that on 150 acres, looking at that ecosystem thrive over those 15 years that we worked on it, that it was sufficiently large to be able to attract and nourish an abundance of life.
But even after you have worked on a 150-acre plot and then going to a 100-acre plot, the scale is still big and it calls for massive investment and resources, both financial and otherwise. So, how did you set the objectives for this in terms of proving people that this is going to be viable? And a large group of people have come along. So, how did you manage to convince them and how did that transition happen?
Yeah, it was hard.
But I'm sure your CA background helped us in a bit because you can show the financial viability.
I think it's a little bit like that. I walked into it quite naively, to be honest, with that little bit of that field of dreams mentality. If you build it, they will come, sort of, right? And when we started working on this land, it was a barren piece of land. And you have this notion that if you're doing something that you think is noble and good, that people will support it and finance it. But at the same time, people also need to see proof of concept very often before they buy into an idea.
Correct.
So what we were doing was at that point in time, suggesting to people that this barren piece of land would become a forest ecosystem that would be an extremely esoteric experience that they could actually participate it and enjoy on a personal level. And for the longest time, people couldn't see it, right?
Correct.
And I think that was a challenge that I didn't foresee early on. So for the first 2 years, we had a lot of friends and family that were keen to be part of it, but I think they just couldn't see it happening.
Okay.
But what happened was probably around the 3 year and 4 year mark, many people who we had spoken to and sort of who had come and seen the space had visited it almost every year. And when they were there the third time and the fourth time, and they were able to see visibly the transformation, uh, we were able to sort of get buy-in from them. Then they were able to understand that maybe in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years, they could then start imagining what it could be like. And to a large extent, what's helped is we've been sort of very perhaps quiet about what we're doing, and it's we've spoken only to a close circle of friends and family,
Okay.
and they in turn have spoken to trusted circles of close friends and family. So it's been a bit of a ripple effect,
Exactly.
and because it's been suggested by somebody that they trust, more and more people have been able to come and trust and appreciate what's happening, and I think we've certainly reached a point now where it's starting to become obvious. People are able to see tangible signs, the number of bees and butterflies and birds. It's very visible now the direction things are going, and now I think it's snowballing into something more beautiful.
So, organic farming is a pretty big thing. And in terms of, since you had a background or rather a family background in farming, you kind of understood the nuances of it. And I'm sure even for taking organic farming to a scale of this size, it must have been tough. So, how did you get started with that? Or was it easy for you to get organic farming? And the location that you chose in Hosur in Tamil Nadu, India, how suitable was the land for organic farming?
So at Vanantara, we aren't necessarily farming on a large scale. It's primarily afforesting the space.
Okay.
All of the farming is honestly for the soul.
Okay.
It's for people to touch and feel the earth and experience the joy of growing something from seed. It's not really for sustenance. But what we are working towards is partnering with local villagers that surround Vanantara and providing them with seeds and inputs and know-how so that they can grow food organically, such that the community can firstly buy produce from them, and then also assist them to move towards selling this outside as well. So we've just started work towards this, and now we've started working with a farmer who has a 3-acre farm, and working towards helping them with their organic practices. At Vanantara, the primary focus is afforestation.
So, on that note, Miyawaki forest is a big thing. I mean, we have spoken about Miyawaki forest sometime back on the show, but is it really that beneficial? Did you consider other methods as well, or was Miyawaki forest your first option when you thought about afforestation?
At Vanantara, we've gone with conventional forestation.
Okay.
So the spacing is what it would be in normal ecosystems, 15 by 15, 20 feet apart, 10 feet apart, depending on size of trees, etc.
Okay.
We have done a few Miyawaki forests at Vanantara,
Okay.
primarily in places where we wanted to create thickets for life to be able to populate the space quickly. We've done a lot of afforestation using Miyawaki forestry in the city. So the last 2 years, we've planted about 45,000 trees now in Bangalore using Miyawaki afforestation. It's a great technique. I mean, I think it's incredible for urban spaces.
Okay.
To repurpose conventional urban landscape, which consists of lawns and small shrubbery, and use this technique is incredible, because the rate of growth is unprecedented as compared to anything else. The amount of biodiversity is phenomenal, and you're able to create a self-sustaining system within barely 2 to 3 years, which does not require any kind of insecticides or pesticides or irrigation. I think the lens has to be very clear, right? You can't. Miyawaki forestation is great to repurpose an urban landscape which would have been otherwise done in a conventional manner, planting lawns and shrubbery. It's incredible to create them and craft them in this way, because if the rate of growth is, say, 10 years, is 10 times, what you're then saying is that you can achieve in 10 years what it would take 100 years of carbon sequestering to do.
Correct.
Which is incredible. But these systems can only house a very small cross section of life, right? You'll have small insects, small birds, a few reptiles, etc. But you can't have larger forms in this space. You do need conventional forestry to do that. And also, these are very expensive methods. You can't afforest large acres and acres of land using this technique.
That's a valid point on the diversity. Now, in terms of the diversity in afforestation in your area, Vanantara, what kind of diversity have you grown? I mean, what are the different trees that you have grown, and what is the trend like? And do people have any preferences, or are you going with the most sustainable ones for the climate?
So we planted, we started with about 250 different species of trees when we first started planting in 2017. And over the years, we've narrowed this down to about roughly about 100 species of trees that we see thrive best in this region.
Nice.
Even the entire 250 species of trees was native, and native to the region that we are in. But it just so happens that perhaps something that grew 30-40 years ago doesn't grow as well now, because climate patterns have changed.
Correct.
So now we find that these 100 species of trees do exceedingly well, and we've the cross section is across forestry species, medicinal tree species, fruiting trees, flowering trees, etc. And we've maintained the balance between the 4 layers that you see, the canopy, tree, subtree, and the understory.
Yeah.
So the proportions of these trees and species selection has been taking that into account, and there hasn't been an emphasis intentionally on any tree that has a high timber value. We've stayed away from that.
Nice.
Things like teak, silver oak, sandalwood, etc. Because no matter how noble the intent is, into the future, when you tell people something is extremely valuable, it's very difficult to turn a blind eye towards it.
Exactly.
So, and everyone who's become part of the community is very happy with the kind of diversity we have. I think people, the only requests we have are uh, for more flowering and fruiting trees, typically,
Nice.
which is normal. I think people obviously would like to have trees that they would like to consume the fruit of, or that they like looking at. And everyone's tastes and preferences is different. But even with fruiting trees, we've got a diversity which is far beyond the typical mango, papaya, banana. We've got star fruit and breadfruit and mangosteen and rambutan. You know, and the beauty of this is you would have flowering and fruiting, which is different season after season, and that attracts a different variety of life, and it adds a different amount of color season after season.
Wonderful.
So the intent of Vanantara was honestly that it was a bit esoteric when we started. We wanted to sequester large amounts of carbon, but we also wanted to create an experience that would be extremely sensory, where everything you saw, everything you heard, smelled, touched was 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 a joy, and that was where we sort of also looked at our species selection from.
That's really wonderful. That's a very noble intent as well. Now, having listened to this conversation, I'm sure like people will get really interested and excited to know how can someone contribute to this. What is the getting started guide if they were to get started with being involved in Vanantara?
Yeah, it would be wonderful. I mean, it would be so nice for people to be part of what we're doing. And we have people being involved in many different ways. Like we have friends who have saplings that they've sort of germinated from seed and they've given to us and that we've planted at Vanantara and continue to nurture. We have folks who've gone a step further and bought plants at nurseries and donated to us that we've also planted and nurtured. And, it just, since this is such a community led event, if this resonates with somebody, spreading the word about what we're doing and becoming part of the community would, if that is something of interest, would be great, because we've chosen to be fairly discreet about what we're doing and spoken only in closer circles of like minded folks.
Okay.
And then I think and I think the kind of audience that you have is the kind of people that actually would be the kind of folks who resonate with what we're trying to achieve at one.
That's a good note on that. So I'll definitely let people contact you directly to kind of get into the other aspects of it, because I'm sure developing this project and sustaining this definitely takes a lot of effort. I also mean the financial effort that goes into it. Although I understand that the financial model is very sustainable, and because you have set this process for more than 10 years now, I'm sure you have seen the viability of it, and people would definitely be interested to look into the funding and other aspect of it as well. So I will leave it to people's discretion to kind of contact you directly on that. Now, on a personal level, Varun, now that this 100-acre project is a success in itself and it's self-sustained in terms of both financial and the project per se, now what's next for the movement and what's next for you as a person? Like, where do you see going next with this?
In terms of what we're trying to do now and with an eye on the future, since this is such an important community led adventure, our work at Vanantara is not done. We continue to afforest, we continue to add more layers of the forest. We continue to rainwater harvest, and importantly now we are starting to create avenues for the community to engage more with one another. Because while everyone is like-minded, many of the folks don't know each other; they haven't met, and it's important for what we're trying to achieve there for people to get to know one another, because as the space is outside the city and we've spent about 2 years in this COVID situation, many people haven't had an opportunity to meet. So one of the important things with what we're trying to do is create that sense of community, because it is important for the space to continue to evolve, for the people that inhabit it to be cohesive. So at Vanantara, immediately that is what we are working towards. The intent surely is to continue to afforest large amounts of land. The idea of Vanantara was to be able to to be able to do this and serve as an example and model, and perhaps something that other people could also see, and hopefully we could have more afforestation avenues as a function of this. And we would love to continue to find lands where we could build more communities that would continue to leave these spaces green into the future. We also, over the recent past, had situations where individuals with large amounts of land and with the intent of having these large lands afforested have also asked us if we could help them.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and then that's great, because it's much, I think in India, the process of acquiring land is often the hardest part. And if you have somebody, who has the land available and who has the intent to do this, it makes the process much quicker, much faster to be able to afforest. This is what we'd like to do. I think it's been a joy seeing the space evolve and seeing these ecosystems flourish so quickly. It's been just 4 years of afforestation, and things have turned so remarkably. It gives you hope that you can continue to do this and help the situation that we're in right now.
True. That's really wonderful, Varun. That I'm sure your work is definitely getting noticed, and it's in the right mediums and right channels. So you are bound to get a lot more traction. I would be actually, in fact, surprised if you haven't received much of this inquiries that you mentioned. So I'm definitely sure that a lot more will be coming your way. Varun, it's been an absolute pleasure having to have spoken to a few times and having you on the podcast today. I personally look forward to being there in Vanantara soon once situations around this pandemic settles down. So thanks for taking time to join me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Girish. It's always a pleasure speaking to you, and I look forward to having you over at Vanantara.
I hope you found the conversation insightful, and I'm sure the story was an inspiration for every one of us who are really asking the question, how can I have a positive impact on the planet? So don't worry, there are a lot of ways in which you can contribute. At least 50 plus ideas have been discussed on this podcast channel, so do check them out. And of course, you can reach out to Varun by visiting vanantara.com or follow him on LinkedIn or on Instagram at Vanantara. The links will be in the show notes section of this podcast episode and also on the website missionshunya.com. So I hope you will come back again in 2 weeks' time for yet another conversation. In the meantime, you can share this podcast in your social networks and help spread the word. So with that, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off. And as always, thank you for listening.